Welcome to the Gold Auditorium. Thank you for coming today. My name is Kendall, and I will be the host for today's lecture. The Hinckley Institute of Politics was established in 1965 through the generous bequest of the Nobel Foundation and Robert H. Hinckley. The Institute is dedicated to teaching students respect for practical politics and the principle of citizen involvement in government. The Hinckley Institute offers paid internships to students of all majors here locally, in Washington, D.C., and in 35 countries around the world. The Hinckley Institute also offers classes, the nation's only campaign management minor, week-long experiences in Washington, D.C., and over $70,000 in academic scholarships. We invite students to walk into Orson Spencer Hall, which is Asst 253, or visit our website at www.hinckley.utah.edu. The Hinckley Institute proudly presents the 17th annual Rocco C. and Marion S. Siciliano Forum. This year's theme is the future of U.S.-Latin American relations. This is the first of 21 events that will extend through next Monday. For a listing of all events, you can pick up a brochure in the back of the room. The title of this afternoon's lecture is The Future of U.S.-Latin American Relations, and it is my honor to introduce Kirk Jowers, the director of the Hinckley Institute, who will continue our introductions.
Kendall deserves a huge ovation, so thank you for doing that for her. She and Alessia Bali and the Hinckley Institute staff have done an amazing job, as well as so many others, to put this incredible Siciliano Forum together. 21 public events. We're so excited to be able to look at such an important topic from so many different angles, to slice it and dice it, and to bring in people from Brazil, from Mexico, from Washington, D.C., and elsewhere, to make sure we really get a firm understanding of the future of U.S.-Latin American relations. Before I begin, I want to thank Rocco and Maria Siciliano. The Siciliano Forum exists only because of his vision, his generosity, and his ongoing support of desire to bring our community together. Through his support, we have these 21 events, which will mean so much to the students and the community on understanding it. It also is doing so much more. It is the catalyst for establishing the Utah-Mexico Chamber of Commerce. It is the catalyst for bringing together different parts of this university to make sure we are more effective at teaching this. It will be a huge part of continuing the Center for Latin American Studies, which has received Title VI funding, the most prestigious grant that can be given from the federal government to an incredible center there. And it will be a centerpiece for that when we go to renew that funding. And it goes on and on. It's an important part of our state's work. Our state, the state of Utah, focused on Latin America last year. Our Governor Herbert, visited Mexico and Brazil on trade missions, and a lot of great relationships, both for higher ed and for business and otherwise, all developed because of that, and this will be a key part of that follow-up. So Rocco, Maria, thank you. It means so much more than even just the information we get here, but these connections will be enduring thanks to you. I also want to thank our sponsors. Because this event has become so ambitious, it's become a village to put it on. The Center for Latin American Studies began meeting with us a year ago as we started thinking about what all do we want to portray, who are the experts who would be ideal to bring in. Jim and Lynn Hinckley, obviously the Hinckley Institute, have been so generous, and specifically on this one, they gifted this incredible photographic exhibit, which is here at the Marriott Library. It's on the first, third, and fifth floor. Immediately following this event, please come to the fifth floor for lunch, a few brief remarks about this exhibit, and then take the time to see it. And immediately following that, I want to thank Dean Comer and all of her staff at the Marriott Library, because they have brought out all of the Latin American rare books exhibit, and it will be incredible. So there's a lot to see. Basically, if you're anywhere in the Marriott Library except for the second floor, you're in a good spot today. There's first, third, fourth, and fifth floors, we have some amazing things related to this. Also, the World Trade Center, Utah, Governor's Office of Economic Development, Benyon Center, and Radio West have all been huge supporters of this year's Siciliano Forum. It's my pleasure to briefly introduce, if he were our speaker, I would go for 20 minutes, but since he's not, I will leave more time for our keynote speaker. But I do want to introduce the man who will introduce our speaker, and that is Mickey Ibarra, who's the president of the Ibarra Strategy Group, and also the founder and chairman of the Latino Leaders Network. Mickey has been a dear friend. He has been another great resource for me and for our staff as we have tried to really put together an incredible event. Mickey is the most connected man in Washington, D.C., especially with the Latino American community, loves it with a passion and loves the University of Utah and the state of Utah with a passion. And I manipulated all of those to have him help us today. With that, I am honored to give you Mickey Ibarra, who will introduce our speaker today.
Thank you. Thank you, Kurt. I'm delighted to join all of you today for the 17th Annual Siciliano Forum. The University of Utah is my alma mater. Salt Lake City is my hometown. Before introducing our keynote speaker today, however, there are a few thoughts I'd like to share with you briefly. First, I, of course, want to thank President Pershing, Kurt Jowers, who we've just heard from, the Hinckley Institute of Politics that has made so much of this possible, and for inviting me to join you today. I also want to add my thanks to Rocco Siciliano and Maria for their support that, again, makes this forum a possibility. 17th Annual Forum. I had the opportunity for the first time to meet Rocco last night at a dinner hosted by President Pershing. Very, very wonderful experience. Yet I've known of Rocco for many years, of course, because of his public service at the highest levels of our nation's capital. His connection to the University of Utah, as well as the connection through my mother, Bonnie Siciliano. It turns out that my mother's second husband, Jack Siciliano, is first cousins to Rocco Siciliano. Now that's a reminder, my friends, it's a small world after all. It's best to be good to everybody, everybody. My 30-year career in Washington now has been a wonderful journey with learning opportunities that I could never have imagined possible. And that's all after 5 years teaching at-risk high school students in the Utah public schools. I feel as though it's now my obligation, more than ever before, to share what I've learned, who I know, what I know, with others. I want to share. That's one motivation for bringing me back to the University of Utah as often as Kurt will invite me. I want to share what I know. After all, the Mickey Ibarra papers, my White House correspondence, over 500 White House photographs, notes, memorabilia, everything I own associated with my political career has now been donated to the J.W. Marriott Special Collections Library. I want to thank Dean Comer, who's with us, also Greg Thompson, for keeping a close eye on that. It's very important, and for helping me to continue to work to make the collection more valuable and useful to the students here at the University of Utah. So when Kurt sought my assistance with finding a keynote speaker for today, it was not very hard for me to figure it out. That had to be Arturo Valenzuela. And I'm so delighted that Dr. Valenzuela has been able to join us today. He's currently a senior advisor for Latin America at a very, very prestigious firm, Covington, Most recently, he served as the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. Department of State under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. In that position, he was responsible for the formulation, execution, and management of U.S. Latin America policy. Arturo and I, however, first met at the White House when he was serving as a special assistant to President Clinton for Latin American affairs with the National Security Council. In that capacity, he advised the President and National Security Advisor on foreign, defense, intelligence, economic, and other policy initiatives throughout the Americas. A noted scholar, Dr. Valenzuela headed the Council of Latin American Studies at Duke University before moving to Georgetown University, where he founded the Center for Latin American Studies and remains on the faculty of the Department of Government Affairs. I consider Arturo a personal friend, a valued colleague, and a great American leader who embraces the belief that while it's nice to be important, it's important to be nice. He made an extraordinary effort to join us today from Washington, D.C., arriving in Salt Lake City at 10:20 this morning. He'll deliver this speech, join us for the reception on the art exhibit which follows, and then be on the 5 o'clock flight back to Washington. He's a busy guy who made time for us. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Arturo Valenzuela.
Well, you can see why it's impossible to say no to Mickey Ibarra. And I'm one of his many fans, and I, of course, when he reached out to me, despite the fact that I'm going to Bogota, Colombia on Tuesday, and was not sure whether I would be able to come here because of a trip to New Hampshire last week, but somehow I managed to get through the snow and the weather and everything, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here joining you today. Particularly for this special event, you know, the Siciliano Forum, the Hinckley Center, you know, and I, as I say, I'm very happy to be here. My career is really as an academic. I actually had a few deviations, and the deviations were 3 times in the U.S. government. The first time actually was in the first Clinton administration, where coming over here from the airport, I was asked, I'd like to do by one of your students, I'd like to do a career like you're doing. And I just simply said, look, it's fortuna, it's chance, it's serendipity, and so on and so forth. What happened to me was that I had moved to Georgetown from Duke University, where I taught for 17 years, and was in Washington, and President Clinton was elected, and a very good friend of mine, Brian Atwood, who was became the head of the Agency for International Development, but was, prior to that, the president of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, was going to go into the AID, and he asked me whether I would be willing to help him out with democracy programs. That's my academic field. You know, I work on the institutional dimensions of democratic governance, and my books are all on that subject. They're not on foreign policy issues. And I said to Brian, sure, I'd be happy to go into the Agency for International Development. We can talk about how one might be able to create more effective programs of this kind. And of course, with that sort of exquisite Washington logic, when my CV went over to the White House Personnel Office, and Mickey knows this really well, somebody in White House personnel said, hey, why don't we send this guy to the State Department? I was actually away. This is the summer of 1993. I was away doing some courses in Argentina and Chile that summer. Came back, called Brian Atwood and said, hey, so when do I start with you? State Department wants you to go. The White House wants you to go to the State Department. I don't want to go to the State Department. Best thing that ever happened to me. was when I actually had to sort of accede to go into the State Department. Why? Not for the reasons that I would have imagined. I thought, I'm an authority on the Southern Cone. I've worked all my life on the politics of Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and so on and so forth. This is my chance to really put my academic knowledge to. And when I went over to the Department of State to talk to the person who was going to be my boss, the assistant secretary, the position I later had, he said to me, look, unfortunately, I've filled all of our positions. The only one that would be available for you is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in charge of the relationship with Mexico. Mexico, the one country I don't know. The best thing that happened to me, because, and this is a lesson, get into something you don't know, start something new. At the time I went in there, the free trade agreement with North America had been signed, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in the Bush administration. President Clinton actually campaigned against it, but then subsequent negotiations were undertaken, and President Clinton finally decides, with the side agreements that I helped to write and then later implement, we moved forward to a very exciting time in U.S.-Mexican relations at the time, moving up towards the election of '94, which was a very important turning point. But this is 20 years ago, folks. 20 years of NAFTA, and I think that's it's actually one of the great achievements of a bipartisan effort, really. It began in the Bush administration, the Clinton administration embraced NAFTA, and I was very lucky that I spent 3 years, essentially working with us. To this day, some of my best friends are in Mexico, former government officials that sat across the table on the other side. Today we look to see how we can create a new vision and strengthen a new vision for North America as well. So that's kind of a brief little anecdote. I went back. Universities only give you 2 years leave. I asked for an additional leave. Had no intention of returning whatsoever. And of course, then in the second Clinton administration, Sandy Berger called me and said, look, we need somebody to do the portfolio for the National Security Council on Latin America. And that's where I met Mickey. He was the head of intergovernmental affairs. He ran all the relationships between the White House and all the governors and all the mayors and everything all across the country. And it was just a great opportunity to work with him and so many wonderful people. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit off the subject, which of course is to talk about U.S.-Latin America relations. But as an academic, I speak exactly 45 minutes, unless it's Tuesday, Thursday, in which case it's an hour and 15 minutes, right? As an academic, I have to go back and give you a little bit more of a broader perspective, I think, contextual perspective. But let me start by saying that I really am optimistic about where things are going in the region, and in the Western Hemisphere generally. I am, despite the bad news that often comes out. This is an incredible continent. Latin America, 600 million people. If you add the U.S. and Canada, it's getting close to 800 million, a billion at some point. It's also a continent that is enormous in size. We don't pay much attention to it, It's one of the great frustrations of doing policy towards the Western Hemisphere is that people just take it for granted or ignore it or don't pay much attention to it. But it's a huge, huge region. The potential is just extraordinary. Brazil is now the 7th largest country in the world in terms of its GNP. It's going to be soon the 5th largest country. We tend to forget that Mexico is actually the 12th largest economy in the world. We tend to forget how large geographically the Americas are and Latin America is. I try to remind we were talking, your dean is originally from Argentina. Do you know that Argentina is the 7th largest country in the world geographically in terms of, Chile is bigger than any European country. I mean, this is a huge, huge continent, with, of course, enormous natural resources and a continent that's really been coming in to its own recently. There used to be a joke that whenever Europe got the sniffles, Latin America would get pneumonia. And in fact, that was the case, going back to before the Great Depression. Every time there was some kind of an international economic crisis, Latin America really had a really hard time. But this time around, in 2008, when the, European countries and the United States, the developed world, got a very, very bad case of more than sniffles, perhaps the worst crisis in economic terms since the Great Depression, and very close to perhaps moving in that direction. Latin America didn't get but a sniffle. In fact, they were doing fairly well. So 10 years of economic growth. Now, it wasn't that long ago, and there still are some problems, and I'll come to that in a minute. It wasn't that long ago. We tend to forget that 30 years ago, all of the countries of Latin America, except for 3, and there's a quiz for the students right here, which of the 3 countries would have been the countries. All of the countries fell into authoritarian forms of government. Only 3 remained as democratic governments. This is the period of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Even countries with long-standing democratic traditions, such as the country that I originally came from Chile, which had from 1837 until 1973 only 15 months of unconstitutional government. It was a country that was able to put together, this extraordinary system that comes out of the Enlightenment, which is government by the rule of the people, subject to institutions that guarantee people's rights, which is what essentially a democratic constitution is about. The Chileans were able, with some difficulties, to put that together, whereas other countries, of course, had very, very, very shallow democratic experiences. But even Uruguay and Chile collapsed into authoritarianism during this period. And let's not forget that in the 1980s also you had civil wars in Central America. Let's not forget the long-standing struggle, which is still being addressed today, of internal conflict in Colombia. So this was a really bad situation if you go back just 30 years ago. Or if you pivot to the economy, and my mic, by the way, came apart. Otherwise, I'd be pacing the room right here.
Go back to the mic.
I'll go back to the mic, but let me just show you something. One of the problems then, in the 1980s, was hyperinflation. Economies that weren't going anyplace. And I tend to carry in my wallet 2 bills right here. This one right here is from Brazil. It's 500,000 cruzeiros. 500,000 cruzeiros, worth less than $1 or something like that. This is what hyperinflation does. And this is what the problem was in the 1980s, hyperinflation. You think it was bad in Brazil? How about 10 millones de pesos bolivianos, 10 million Bolivian pesos. This is a 10 million Bolivian pesos bill, worth maybe $2. What did you do when you had to go buy bread? You had to carry a wheelbarrow. You had to walk around with stacks of this stuff. This was the other problem with the Latin America. In the 1980s, it stagnated. And I'll come back to the microphone. It stagnated. But it also invented hyperinflation. So this was this anomaly of, that goes against economic theory, right? I mean, you're high levels of inflation, but no growth. So this is not a pretty picture. Just 30 years ago. What changed? What's the huge critical change? The end of the Cold War. Essentially, with the end of the Cold War, the situation in Latin America began to change significantly. Oh, now I can walk around. Between 1930 and 1980, 42% of all changes of government were through military coups. In the decade of the 1980s, this very bad decade, but it was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, military coups accounted for 20% changes of government. From 1990 until today, there really are only 3 sort of classic military coups where a head of state is actually basically taken out at gunpoint, or just, that doesn't mean that other presidents didn't have to resign because they couldn't govern. But there's been a significant change. And then in the 1990s, 80s, and then 90s, economic policy measures were put into place. Many people deride them as neoliberal reforms, which made things worse for Latin America, but that's not true. These neoliberal reforms were absolutely fundamental. They were necessary conditions to try to get away from a pattern of economic unsustainability, which is what this lost decade of the 1980s was about. And it essentially consisted of introducing macroeconomic stabilization policies and structural reforms, independent central banks, fiscal policies that balance budgets, that look towards trying to balance budgets, and reducing the size of overbloated states. Now, for some people, there's been a lot of criticism of these policies because they were tough. And today, the debate on Greece, for example, revolves around those. To what degree do you apply austerity measures? To what degree do you apply other sorts of measures? The fact of the matter is that those policies on their own wouldn't have really addressed some of the really significant problems that Latin America faced. Extreme poverty, still, legacy of the past, great inequality. But increasingly democratic governments were added then to these economic policies of the 1990s, additional measures to try to reduce significant levels of inequality and to particularly address the problems of absolute poverty. So there was a move towards a shift away from just simply applying economic policy without worrying also about some of the social consequences. And that led then in country after country after country to an improvement of the situation in the region. Now, what I thought I would do is, having said, that 30 years ago things were bad, there's been significant improvement. Why was that the case? Let me repeat what I said earlier. The end of the Cold War is really what makes the difference. The authoritarianism of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s was directly related to the Cold War. And the US policy during that period, and we're reminded of it now as the United States looks to try to change some of the Cuba policy. And I'll get to that at the end of my discussion. But what changes is that the United States and other countries in the hemisphere pivot away from what was known as the national security state to embracing democratic institutions as fundamental goals. And this begins actually in the second Reagan administration. It begins with a shift away from what you might call the Kirkpatrick doctrine in the beginning of the Reagan administration, which essentially argued that authoritarians are good because there's no way that if you're not going to really get democracies in these countries anyway, the worst thing could be a totalitarian sort of outcome, which would be communist. So let's just tolerate authoritarianisms. Towards the second Reagan administration, there's a palpable change in that direction with the notion that, wait a minute, maybe these authoritarians are part of the problem because by denying fundamental freedoms, they're also making it impossible for democratic institutions to take significant root. And of course, then that shifts dramatically in the first Bush administration, where the first Bush administration takes on the end of the Central American wars. And you get a shift away from that and an encouragement of democratic institutions. And it becomes then the task really of the post-Cold War governments to try to see how they can encourage the consolidation of democratic institutions in the region. And that's when we were working in the White House with President Clinton. Let me say something interesting here. It's the Latin Americans that were pushing most strongly to move in that direction. There was one very important turning point, which was the adoption at the Organization of American States of Resolution 1080 in 1991. Resolution 1080 in 1991 argues that any interruption of the democratic order will lead to an immediate invoking of a meeting of the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States to try to address the issue. In fact, it's used after Aristide's overthrown in Haiti in 1991, where, in fact, the OAS could not take this on, but where the UN finally, ultimately, takes on a significant responsibility under its peacekeeping authorities to try to address the problem. So there began to grow a significant consensus that everyone had to work together to try to establish and to strengthen democratic institutions. The US government takes a very important lead then. I can tell you how, on a personal level, it affected me, because even though I was in charge of the relationship with Mexico, and that was my primary responsibility, where, by the way, my primary task was to try to see how we could persuade the Mexicans to persuade us that the 1994 election in Mexico was going to be done honestly and transparently, when the 1988 election in Mexico did not go that well. It wasn't an easy task, because I would go see the chief of staff of the president of Mexico, I would see the foreign minister of Mexico, I'd see the ambassador in Washington, and I would say, we need to know whether or not this election is going to take place honestly and transparently, and in order for that, we need to have some kind of guarantees for that. How about international observers? We voted against international observers at the United Nations. We voted against international observers at the Organization of American States. But finally, the Mexicans themselves were persuaded that, in fact, it was important for them, and they did ask for a mission from the United Nations to be able to go in there and to help supervise the election of 1994 as an important way to demonstrate to the world. And in fact, they did the reforms of the electoral system that were really rather significant. I followed that very closely at that time. So these were real efforts that were done collectively to try to see how one could try to strengthen democratic institutions. Okay, having said that, what are some of the difficulties? It's not easy. I remind my students that it was not until after World War II that the most important countries in Western Europe were finally able to consolidate democratic institutions. And we're talking about, Germany, Italy, Spain, and others. After the horrific breakdowns of the 20th century, these processes are not difficult. And in fact, if you look at this period from the 1990s on, 1983-84 is where I usually started. I wrote an article on this, and that was looking at the failed presidencies in the region in Latin America, not overthrown by military governments, but the 3 or 4 governments in Argentina, for example, that did not succeed. In fact, Argentina's first democratic president did not finish his term. His successor of his own party did not finish his term. You had several people. I could go down and name. In fact, it's another question I asked my students. Okay, so what are some of the countries where presidents actually had to resign from office even though they weren't overthrown in a military coup? And you had a couple of impeachments in Venezuela and in Brazil. Those, and perhaps more recently in Paraguay, although that was controversial. But then you had presidents that just simply had to throw in the towel. They just simply had to throw in the towel because they couldn't govern. So what I'm saying is that despite this sort of generally optimistic scenario that I'm giving you, the fact of the matter is that consolidating institutions takes a long time. And perhaps the Achilles heel still in many countries in Latin America is the full embrace of the rule of law. The full embrace of the rule of law. You can have democratic governance, but what happens if you don't really, have a judiciary that can, in fact, make sure that the rules of the game are accepted by everyone, and that, in fact, you will be punished if, in fact, you're not able to abide by the law. And this is where there's really a significant deficit. Although, as a Latin American scholar, I would always, right now, even before I got into this point in this speech, I would be also telling you about the significant differences in the region. A country like Chile I mentioned earlier, because of that long-standing democratic tradition, also has one of the most effective judicial systems of any country in the region. It abides by the rule of law. And in terms of indicators such as transparency, international, and other things like that, or even the quality of democratic governance, it ranks ahead of many other countries, and in some indicators ahead of the United States in terms of its openness and so on. Uruguay also has a very strong tradition of that, of democratic politics. It broke down too in 1973, but it has very solid institutions. In Central America, just to show that it's not just a southern cone, large countries. Costa Rica, of course, also was able to put together fairly strong institutions of governance. But the task and the challenge in many other places is still very great to try to consolidate these democratic institutions. Let me pivot at this particular point a little bit and maybe relax on the podium what has U.S. policy been? What has U.S. policy been since then and today, and where is it going? Let me just repeat again, the single most important turning point really is the end of the Cold War, where the U.S. pivots away from a different approach to the region, where we essentially were so focused, and perhaps rightly so. At certain points, if you're working for the President of the United States, you're working at the National Security Council, and you're thinking about the fundamental interests of the country and the security challenges of the country, you're going to focus on those sorts of things. For example, when we talk a little bit about Cuba today, and some people say, and perhaps rightly so, that look, this is a policy that didn't work for 50 years. It's forgetting that in the first few years, the whole Cuba phenomena was directly right smack in the middle of the Cold War, where the Cubans actually allowed the Soviets to put missiles on their ground, and we came this close. The only time really we came to nuclear conflagration. And it wasn't the United States that took the lead in throwing Cuba out of the Organization of American States. It was other countries in Latin America who were very worried about the fact that Cuba was actually trying to arm revolutionaries in various countries like that and trying to sort of overthrow some of the regimes in the countries. This was a Cold War environment that was very, very difficult one. But again, on Cuba, you would ask yourself the question, well, wait a minute. Something did happen after the end of the Cold War, but with Cuba, perhaps we did not change our chip with regard to the Cold War. Let me go back, though, and say some of the things that the administrations have tried to do since then to try to create a different, what would be the best way to put it would be a different approach to treat countries in the region more as equals. Also, not to get necessarily involved in the internal affairs of the countries. To try to make sure that, in fact, they make their own decisions on their own. If you don't have a fundamental security imperative in mind that you worry about, such as the potential attack of the Soviets or something like that, and that's not your driving principle, then what's most important is not try to manipulate internally the internal affairs of other countries. And I think that starting in the Bush administration and through the Clinton administration in particular, this was the approach. How do we engage with our neighbors as partners to create a common future together? Now there's a little bit of a reversal of this pattern in the second Bush administration after 9/11. 9/11 does affect things in a rather significant way, and there really is a parting of the dialogue between the United States that began after the end of the Cold War, after 9/11, because the United States focused so heavily on the terrorist threat. It was a national security imperative. The United States was attacked at the time, And so the United States essentially moved away then from this more fluid dialogue that we had before and tried to impose upon Latin Americans a different sort of agenda. And this was resented in Latin America. And it wasn't resented just at the level of mass publics or just in governments on the left, but also in governments on the right. Mexico at that particular time was governed by Vicente Fox, the first democratically elected alternative to the PRI, a party of the right. When George W. Bush came into office, he emphasized that his top priority was going to be Latin American policy, and particularly policies with Mexico. But after 9/11, when the Security Council resolutions come up, authorizing, or that were supposed to authorize the United States to carry out the attacks on Iraq, guess what two countries were at the United Nations Security Council? Mexico, the closest ally, really, of the United States at that particular point, and Chile, a country that the United States had worked very closely with. And both countries disagreed with authorizing the second resolution at the United Nations. And this led to a real kind of falling out. Vicente Fox, the president of Mexico, called several times the White House to talk to President Bush, and he wouldn't return his call. The Chileans were supposed to sign a free trade agreement with the United States, comparable to a free trade agreement that was started with Singapore at the same time. Well, Singapore got to sign its free trade agreement in Washington at the White House. The Chileans had to sign their free trade agreement with the United States in Miami at the ministerial level, that is only with the Secretary of State, and did not get that, because there was essentially, they were being punished for not, and this created something of a tension in the region. Sort of, the United States is being too unilateral, is trying to dictate to us the way we need to do it. We don't think, in fact, I was fairly close to both the Chilean and the Mexican ambassador to the United Nations when this was going on. Adolfo Aguilar Sinzer on the one hand and Juan Gabriel Valdez on the other. And they listened to all the briefings of the inspectors at the UN, and they basically sort of say, they advise their governments, look, we don't see the evidence for the weapons of mass destruction. So therefore, we're not going to vote in this direction. And they didn't. Well, this led to some significant tension. And this then, let me pivot then to the Obama administration, was one of the tasks that the Obama administration faced was, how can we try to, at this particular point, reinitiate the dialogue with the countries of the Americas, going back to this notion that we need to do it on the basis of the fact that we're partners on an equal footing in order to be able to have a good and close dialogue. And I think that's where we are today. We're trying to do that. Let me end this because I want to permit. Let me end this now. I want to permit some questions and give you some responses as well. But let me just simply say, there's a little bit of a sort of a double standard in my view in the press. On the one hand, people say, the United States is now neglecting Latin America. You don't pay any attention to us anymore. On the other hand, some of the same people who say the United States is neglecting Latin America are the same ones that say we worry that the United States gets involved too closely in Latin America and basically dictating to folks, you know. And I've actually found that in my own way. People in the opposition in several countries coming up to me and saying, you know, we missed the Latin America before, you know, when you helped us get bad presidents out of office. And, you know, I would have to go out of my way and say, we don't do that anymore. But why? Your fundamental interests are being affected. Look, our fundamental interests are not at stake at this particular point. Our fundamental interests are that you get your governance process on track and that you strengthen your own institutions. And that's going to be best done if it's not essentially dictated from Washington or carved or created in Washington. Too many folks got used to the fact that they could come to Washington and basically run the politics of their own country in Washington rather than trying to get their act together locally. So I think that that's one of the real challenges for many of the countries that are still weaker in this regard in terms of their institutional development. Is the United States worried about the Chinese? Well, look, a lot of people have asked me that. In fact, I initiated a dialogue with the Chinese on Latin American policy and went to Beijing, with my team, and big headline saying, United States not worried about China. What is the criticism? Oh, the United States used to be the main trading partner with Latin America. Now the Chinese are the main trading partner with several countries, so therefore we've dropped the ball. Well, wait a minute. We don't need iron ore. We don't need necessarily more copper. If the Latin Americans have and 3 commodities are the critical commodities that go from Latin America to China. It's copper, 20%, and iron ore and soybeans, the other 40%, and then the rest of it is other stuff. We don't import those sorts of things. And isn't it in our interest if the Latin American countries export these crops and therefore become wealthier and buy our farm machinery? Of course. So, that's a little bit of a red herring as well. And there is increasing also China fatigue in Latin America at this particular point. These guys come around, they say they're going to build a highway, and they show up with 5,000 Chinese to build a highway. And where's the work that we were promised that we were going to get? Anyway, but all in all, some of these things are a little bit exaggerated. The fact of the matter is, and here I really will add so that I can ask questions, 42% of all exports go to the Western Hemisphere. 42%. The United States represents close to 40% of all direct foreign investment in Latin America. There's no country that has as much influence, if you forget about the sort of public side, in Latin America than the United States does. Why? Partly because of the diasporas, partly because of the link to these communities that are, a very significant portion of the Ecuadorians live in the United States. Partly because, and you saw the Academy Awards last night, who won Best Picture? A Mexican. Birdman. Pretty talented folks, And if you look at sort of the presence of U.S. media and or how even our own country is also evolving to incorporate, a lot of these sort of cultural expressions that bind us together. So this is a continent that we're linked. It's a continent that is pretty much at peace. It's a continent that doesn't have irredentist politics. That is where subalternate loyalties, like ethnic loyalties or religious loyalties or regional loyalties, are going to try to push for the establishment of alternative sovereign states, which is what irredenta is all about, coming from southern Italy, trying to, essentially create your own sovereign identity. That doesn't exist in the New World. You can't say that about Europe today. In fact, the only country where there is sort of an irredentist problem in the Western, it's not a problem today, but conceivably, and it was, is Canada with Québécois, So we're optimistic. I think things are going in the right direction. We need to be patient. We need to understand that transitions are difficult and complicated. I haven't talked about Venezuela, which is really, very, very serious trouble today because they followed populist policies of the 70s. Argentina has also made some really significant mistakes, in my view, and I think that's recognized by the international community. Today, you see, however, a really dynamic Pacific with Peru, Mexico, Colombia, and Chile in this alliance of the Pacific, where there's more integration at this particular point than there was, based on free trade agreements rather than on customs union frameworks, such as the Brazilians have put together and others. So you see some differentiation in the region, but generally speaking, it's going okay. Look, here I will stop. Our auto industry would not have recovered the way it recovered if it hadn't been for the success of NAFTA and the integration of North America. Thanks.
If you'd like to ask questions, please speak clearly into the microphone and I will pass pass it around.
Would you comment on President Obama's overtures to Cuba?
Sure, be happy to. Look, as you might imagine, the beginning of some of this actually dates back to the Clinton administration, where similar sorts of efforts were tried in the first term, and they didn't succeed because the Cubans shot down 2 airplanes, and this is what led to the promulgation of the Libertad Act. In fact, one of the ironies of my own situation is I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the time, went up with Ann Patterson, who was my colleague as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. She later went on to become Ambassador to El Salvador, but more recently also to Pakistan and to Egypt. So she has an extraordinary career. We went up at the end of 1995 to testify against the Helms-Burton Act, and in February of 1996, the Cubans shoot down 2 airplanes of people who were distributing leaflets there, and that led to President Clinton having to sign the Cuban Libertad Act, which codified essentially the embargo. So the initiatives that were started in the Clinton administration just didn't go very far. What about these initiatives today? Let me make one point really clear. They obviously are based on the president's authority. If he has his authority to be able to sort of see how the regulations are implemented. And there are some red lines that he cannot cross. And so full trade normalization, full economic normalization is not going to take place until that embargo is lifted. The law itself says, in fact, that the president can lift it, but only if he certifies that Cuba has become a democratic country, and that there's a vibrant democratic political process. The president can't certify that because Cuba is not that. So, it's unlikely that this embargo is going to be lifted. But what is the fundamental assumption behind what the president has done and what animated us? I worked very hard on this one in the first Obama term. What animated us was, and where at this particular point we argue that the current policy is not working, is that Cubans do not have an independent civil society. Civil society in Cuba is a captive civil society. There really is no significantly autonomous civil society. And what these measures that the president is introducing right now are simply measures that will help open much more exchange with Cubans, and to free up a whole host of mechanisms. The government in Cuba says that it wants to create a private sector. Well, let's try to engage with this new private sector. Let's set in regulations that will create that. Opponents say, oh no, this is just giving money to the Cuban government. The Obama administration's answer is, well, look, the Cuban government may get some more money by people going down and investing there, but what's more important really is to try to see whether there's a way in which you can create a more independent and more autonomous civil society, because only with a more autonomous civil society are you going to be able to get that kind of expression. By the way, one thing that's really seized me recently is that there was a young Cuban artist who, after the Tania Bruguera, look her up. What's really struck me is that Tania Bruguera is a performing artist, and she had a license from the Cuban government to go all over the world to do her thing when she does these events in public places where she hands out a microphone and people express themselves on what they think about their, and she sort of called for an event like this right after President Obama spoke to Raul Castro. Guess what? She was arrested. 2,000 artists across the world have written letters to the Cubans saying, what's going on right here? And what I found it intriguing is that I heard from my friends in Latin America who have been very much involved in this sort of kind of radical student movement and has been protesting against the conditions of universities and so on and so forth. They're very much in solidarity with this young woman in Cuba. So this is not a left-right issue anymore in many places. It's whether or not you're really being able to allow the creation of freedom of expression, and so that's the nub of the policy, is how do you sort of engage with the Cuban society and not allow the regime to really maintain this society essentially isolated. I learned that also from some of the key political dissidents, particularly Osvaldo Payá. Osvaldo Payá was against the embargo. Osvaldo Payá was against the embargo. He was tragically killed, as you know. Well, why was he against the embargo? He was very eloquent. I heard him in Washington at an NDI event, in fact. He came over to speak at Georgetown. And he said, I want to be able to deal with the people I want to be able to deal with. How come they can't come and see me? You know, I'm barring my own government from going. How come other governments are barring my friends from coming to see me? Anyway, so that's kind of the nub of the rationale behind the policy. It's not that so the people aren't skeptical of the Cubans. I am skeptical. You know, I'll tell you, just between us, I guess I can't say that because we're on camera. But look, you need to understand that there are also hardliners in Havana, and there are softliners in Havana as well. And it's not quite clear today who is up or down. Thanks.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we do have a reception upstairs on the 5th floor, so you will have a chance to ask more questions from Mr. Valenzuela. We're so grateful to have all of our students and staff and administrators and faculty here. Please join me in thanking our speaker.